The 5 acres of hillside property had been in my family for 3 generations. My grandfather purchased this land in the 1950s, recognizing both its beauty and its challenges. The property sat at a crucial junction where runoff from the surrounding hills converged before continuing downslope. My grandfather, an engineer by training, had designed and built a small but ingenious dam system that controlled this water flow, protecting not only our land but everything below it. When I inherited the property 15 years ago, I took my stewardship role seriously. I maintained the dam meticulously, clearing debris after storms, reinforcing weak spots, and ensuring the controlled water release system functioned properly. It was not just infrastructure, it was my heritage, a physical connection to my grandfather's foresight and wisdom. The system looked simple to untrained eyes, a concrete and stone structure with an engineered spillway and retention pond. But its simplicity masked its critical importance. The neighboring properties had changed hands many times over the decades. Most new owners appreciated the quiet, natural setting and respected the unofficial community we had established. Mrs. Patterson to the east brought over fresh, baked goods regularly. Tom and Sarah across the road always invited me to their summer barbecues. We helped each other with projects, shared tools, and looked out for one another without needing formal rules or restrictions. That all changed 3 years ago when developers purchased the large tract of land below my property. They subdivided it into 30 upscale lots and marketed them as hillside estates. The glossy brochures promised luxury living with nature views. What they failed to mention was that the entire development sat in what would be a water collection area without my grandfather's careful engineering. Within 6 months, all homes were sold to wealthy professionals from the city seeking suburban tranquility. Initially, interactions were pleasant if somewhat distant. I introduced myself to several new neighbors, including Barbara Winters, a former corporate executive with a permanently perfect blonde bob and a smile that never seemed to reach her eyes. She spoke enthusiastically about creating a proper community with standards. The formation of the Hillside Estates Homeowners Association happened quickly after that. Notices appeared in mailboxes announcing the first meeting at the newly constructed community center. I attended out of curiosity and concern, sitting quietly in the back row as Barbara efficiently orchestrated her election as HOA president. Her presentation included slides of manicured lawns, uniform mailboxes, and coordinated holiday decorations. "Property values are our priority," Barbara announced to nods of approval from the audience. "We must ensure that all homes and landscapes meet the standards worthy of hillside estates." I shifted uncomfortably when she unveiled the thick binder of proposed regulations. Everything from approved paint colors to acceptable garden plants was specified in excruciating detail. When I raised a question about existing properties predating the development, Barbara fixed me with a cool stare. "All visible properties affecting our community aesthetic will eventually need to comply," she stated firmly. "Grandfathering exceptions only delay the inevitable improvement of our neighborhood." As I drove home that evening, dark clouds gathered over the hills. A light rain began to fall, and I watched the water flow perfectly through the dam system my grandfather had built. Something told me that the gathering storm clouds were not just in the sky, but in my future as well. I had no idea how right I was or how tragically this story would unfold. The first HOA violation notice arrived 3 weeks after the inaugural meeting. The official letterhead and formal language made it look like a legal document rather than a complaint about my mailbox color. According to the notice, my weathered blue mailbox did not comply with the approved color palette of forest green, matte black, or burnished bronze. I had 72 hours to repaint or replace it before daily fines would begin. I found it ridiculous but decided it was not worth fighting over. The next day, I purchased a can of matte black paint and spent my Saturday morning repainting a perfectly good mailbox. As I worked, Barbara drove by slowly in her white luxury SUV. She did not wave or stop, but I saw her making note of something on a clipboard. That should have been my first real warning. 2 weeks later, another notice arrived. This time, my natural rock garden was deemed excessively rustic and required proper landscaping with approved plants. The following week, my porch lights were too bright and not in conformity with dark sky standards. Each complaint seemed designed to slowly erase the character and history of my property. I complied with each demand. Believing that eventually they would run out of trivial issues to target. I replaced light fixtures, replanted garden sections, and even repainted my front door from red to an approved shade of brown. Each change felt like surrendering a small piece of my home's identity, but I valued peace over confrontation. That changed on a crisp autumn morning when Barbara appeared at my door, accompanied by two other HOA board members. She wore a crisp white pantsuit and carried her ever-present clipboard. Behind her stood Gerald Fisher, a retired banker, and Diane Montgomery, a real estate agent who had sold many of the neighborhood homes. "Good morning," Barbara said without warmth. "We are conducting a full property assessment today." I reluctantly allowed them onto my porch but did not invite them inside. "I believe I have addressed all compliance issues," I stated firmly. "Most cosmetic issues, yes," Barbara replied, making a note, "but we have concerns about that structure behind your house." My stomach tightened. They were talking about the dam. I watched as the three of them walked the perimeter of my property, stopping frequently at the water control system. Barbara took photographs while Gerald poked at the stonework with his shoe. "That structure is not merely decorative," I explained when they returned. "It is an engineered water control system that protects all the properties downstream, including your homes." Barbara frowned. "It is an unsightly concrete block disrupting the natural landscape. There is no mention of required water control in any geological survey we received." "Because my dam has been managing the water for 70 years, I said, feeling heat rise in my face. "Without it, the runoff from these hills would flow directly into your development." Gerald scoffed. "Modern drainage systems make such primitive structures unnecessary. Besides, it does not fit the aesthetic standards of hillside estates." I spent the next 30 minutes explaining watershed management, showing them historical rainfall data and the engineering principles behind the dam. I described how the system had prevented flooding during major storms for decades. Barbara listened with narrowed eyes before cutting me off. "We will have our experts look into this matter," she said dismissively. "In the meantime, expect formal notice regarding this eyesore." 1 week later, the expected letter arrived by certified mail. The HOA deemed my unauthorized water feature to be in violation of multiple aesthetic and structural guidelines. They generously granted me 30 days to remove it or face daily fines of $100. That evening, I stood beside the dam as sunset painted the sky orange and red. I placed my hand on the cool stone my grandfather had laid decades ago. The structure was solid, functional, and absolutely essential for managing water flow from the hills. Removing it would be more than losing a piece of family history. It would remove the only protection against nature's force when heavy rains came. As I turned to walk back to my house, another envelope caught my eye, stuck halfway under my welcome mat. Unlike the official HOA notices, this was plain white with no return address. Inside was a single printed line: "They are just getting started, be prepared." The formal demolition order arrived exactly 30 days after the initial warning. The thick envelope contained multiple documents with legal terminology designed to intimidate. The main letter, signed by all 7 HOA board members, demanded immediate removal of the unauthorized water control structure within 14 days. The fines had increased to $200 daily for noncompliance. My hands trembled as I read through the papers. This was no longer about mailboxes or garden rocks. This threatened both my financial security and the safety of the entire neighborhood. That night I could not sleep. Instead, I sat at my computer researching HOA regulations, property rights, and water management laws. The deeper I dug, the more complex the situation became. According to state law, HOAs had significant power to enforce aesthetic standards, but there were limits, especially concerning safety infrastructure and pre-existing structures. My dam clearly predated the HOA by decades and served a crucial safety function. But fighting would require legal representation I could not easily afford. The next morning, I called several attorneys who specialized in property disputes. Their responses were discouraging. Legal battles against HOAs typically cost between $10,000 and $20,000 with no guarantee of success. One lawyer was bluntly honest about my chances. HOAs have deep pockets and the patience to drag things out, he explained. Even if you win eventually, they can make your life miserable for years. Most homeowners give up simply because they cannot sustain the fight financially or emotionally. Desperate for allies, I created flyers explaining the situation and distributed them to my neighbors. The flyer included historical photos of the area during heavy rains, showing how the dam prevented flooding that would otherwise inundate the lower properties. I invited everyone to my home to discuss the issue, hoping for strength in numbers. Only 3 neighbors showed up. Mrs. Patterson brought cookies as always, but her eyes were apologetic. Tom and Sarah came because they had known me for years, but they sat stiffly on my couch, clearly uncomfortable. The newer residents from Hillside Estates had unanimously declined. Most people are afraid to oppose Barbara, Tom admitted quietly. The Millers questioned an HOA decision last month, and suddenly they were receiving violation notices almost daily. Their children are not even allowed to use the community pool now due to some technicality. Realizing I needed professional support, I hired Robert Mendes, a water management engineer with 30 years of experience. He spent an entire day examining the dam, taking measurements, and reviewing historical weather data for the area. His conclusion was unequivocal. "This is not decorative, it is functional infrastructure," he stated in his formal assessment. "The design is actually quite sophisticated for its time. Removing it would redirect approximately 30,000 gallons of water during heavy rainfall events directly into the properties below. The new development does not have adequate drainage to handle this volume." Armed with this professional assessment, I requested time to speak at the next HOA meeting. The community center was packed with residents, most avoiding eye contact with me as I walked to the front. Barbara sat center stage at a long table with the other board members flanking her like a tribunal. I presented Robert's findings methodically, showing diagrams of water flow patterns and photographs from past storms. Robert stood beside me, adding his professional credibility to my case. For a moment, I saw concern flash across the faces of some board members. Gerald shifted uncomfortably, and Diane glanced nervously at Barbara. "Thank you for your presentation," Barbara said when I finished. "However, our own assessment from Prestige Property Development indicates no significant risk. Their modern drainage solutions can handle typical rainfall." "Prestige is the same company that built your homes," I pointed out. "They have a vested interest in downplaying any issues with the development site." Barbara's smile tightened. "We will take your concerns under advisement. Now, we need to move on to other business." The meeting continued as if my presentation had never happened. Before adjourning, the board unanimously voted to proceed with enforcement actions regarding my non-compliant structure. The sharp bang of Barbara's gavel made me flinch. As people filed out, a man I did not recognize whispered as he passed, "They decided this outcome weeks ago. The meeting was just theater." I stood alone in the emptying room, watching as neighbors hurried past without acknowledging me. Through the large windows, I could see storm clouds gathering on the distant horizon, an ominous mirror to the human storm brewing around me. My grandfather had built the dam to protect this community. Now I stood as its last defender against not just nature, but human arrogance and control. The daily fines began accumulating immediately after the 14-day grace period expired. $200 per day mounted quickly, creating a financial hemorrhage I could not sustain indefinitely. Each morning, a new violation notice appeared, documenting another day of willful noncompliance and the growing total I owed the HOA. By the end of the first month, I owed $6,000. The HOA sent formal notice that they would place a lien on my property if the fines and remediation were not addressed within 30 days. A lien would not only damage my credit, but could eventually lead to foreclosure proceedings. My family home, the place where 3 generations had lived, could be taken from me over a conflict about a dam. I scheduled a consultation with Marcus Harrington, an attorney specializing in property disputes. His office was modest but professional, with diplomas and certifications covering one wall. Marcus listened carefully as I explained the situation, reviewing the engineering report and photographs I had brought. "You have a legitimate case," he said finally. "The dam clearly predates the HOA, and removing infrastructure that prevents flooding could create liability issues for the HOA themselves." Hope flickered briefly until he continued. "However, litigation would likely take 12 to 18 months. During that time, the fines would continue accumulating, potentially exceeding $50,000. The HOA knows this. They are counting on financial pressure forcing your compliance before a court can rule." "So they and simply bankrupt me into submission?" I asked, despair evident in my voice. "Unfortunately, that is a common tactic," Marcus confirmed. "I can file for an emergency injunction to pause the fines while we litigate, but approval is not guaranteed. You should be prepared to spend at least $15,000 in legal fees with no certainty of success." That evening, I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by bills, legal documents, and my dwindling savings statements. The television played in the background, largely ignored until a weather report caught my attention. The meteorologist pointed to swirling patterns on the map, her expression serious. "Long-range forecasts are predicting an unusually active rainy season beginning next month," she explained. "The jet stream pattern indicates potential for sustained precipitation levels 20 to 30% above normal. Residents in flood-prone areas should begin preparations now." I stared at the screen, a cold feeling spreading through my chest. The timing could not be worse. If I were forced to remove the dam before these rains arrived, the consequences for the neighborhood could be catastrophic. I printed the Weather Service's long-range forecast and added it to my growing file of evidence. The next HOA meeting arrived with the fines now totaling $9,800. I requested another opportunity to speak, this time bringing both Robert's engineering assessment and the Weather Service predictions. Board members shifted uncomfortably as I laid out the potential for disaster in clear, unemotional terms. "You are not just asking me to remove a structure," I concluded. "You are asking me to remove the only protection this neighborhood has against the heavy rains that are scientifically predicted to arrive within weeks. The liability for resulting damage will rest with this board." For the first time, I saw uncertainty in some faces. Diane, the real estate agent, looked particularly troubled. Gerald studied the weather maps with a furrowed brow, but Barbara quickly reasserted control. "We appreciate your amateur meteorology," she said with a dismissive wave. "However, our development was built to modern code with proper drainage systems. Your outdated concrete barrier is both unsightly and unnecessary." "It is not a barrier, it is a water management system," I corrected, frustration evident in my voice. "The decision has been made," Barbara responded coldly. "The fines will continue until compliance is achieved. Additionally, the board has authorized legal proceedings to place a lien on your property if payment is not received by the end of next week." That night, a light rain fell as I sat on my porch considering my options. The drops pattered gently on the dam's spillway, flowing exactly as my grandfather had designed decades ago. The sound had always been soothing to me, a reminder of problem-solving and foresight. Now it felt like a countdown to inevitable disaster. 3 days later, I watched with a heavy heart as a small excavation team arrived at my property. I had made the painful decision to comply rather than lose my home. The workers looked uncomfortable, aware of the dam's purpose. Their foreman reviewed Robert's engineering plans with concern. "Are you sure about this, sir?" he asked quietly. "This is a proper water control system. Removing it seems unwise." "I have no choice," I replied, handing him the demolition permit I had been required to obtain at my own expense. For 2 days, the sound of jackhammers and equipment filled the air as they dismantled my grandfather's legacy piece by piece. Each concrete section removed felt like losing part of my family history. The workers carefully preserved the natural water channel beneath, but without the control structures, nothing would slow the water during heavy rainfall. As the final pieces were loaded into trucks, dark clouds gathered above the hills. I stood alone where the dam had proudly stood for 70 years, now just bare earth and exposed rock. A single raindrop fell on my cheek, followed by another. The weather was changing, and I had never felt more helpless in my life. The Regional Weather Service upgraded their forecasts from concerning to potentially hazardous, as satellite imagery confirmed a series of storm systems forming offshore. Meteorologists appeared on local news with increasing frequency, pointing to ominous swirls of red and purple on their maps. Terms like atmospheric river and sustained precipitation event became part of daily conversations. I watched these reports with growing dread, knowing what was coming and unable to stop it. Without the dam, the hillside watershed had lost its only management system. When the heavy rains arrived, water would flow unimpeded down the natural channels, directly into hillside estates. The development's drainage system might handle normal rainfall, but would be overwhelmed by the volumes my grandfather's dam had controlled for decades. I began preparing my own property immediately. Years of maintaining the dam had taught me to respect water's destructive potential. I purchased sandbags and created barriers around my foundation. I rented commercial-grade water pumps and positioned them strategically. I moved valuable and sentimental items to the second floor. My preparations were thorough, but brought me no satisfaction. I knew what others below me would face. The ethical dilemma kept me awake at night. Did I have a responsibility to warn neighbors who had supported the HOA against me? Eventually, conscience won over resentment. I created simple, anonymous flyers with practical flood preparation advice. Under cover of darkness, I placed these in mailboxes of homes most vulnerable to the coming waters, particularly those directly in the path of what would now be uncontrolled runoff. Urgent properties in this area may experience significant water issues during the upcoming rainy season. Consider moving valuables to upper floors, obtaining flood insurance immediately, purchasing water pumps while supplies last, preparing evacuation plans for family and pets. The first substantial rainfall arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. It was not the major system forecasted, but a precursor, a taste of what was coming. Even this moderate shower created immediate changes in water flow patterns. Small puddles formed in areas that had always stayed dry. The natural channel where the dam had stood ran fast and brown with silt, spreading wider than it had in decades. From my kitchen window, I observed several neighbors discovering unexplained water pooling against their foundations. One couple spent hours frantically digging a makeshift drainage trench. Another homeowner tried to divert water with plastic sheeting and garden tools. These minor inconveniences were just warnings of the disaster to come. The next evening, as drizzle continued intermittently, an impromptu neighborhood gathering formed under the community gazebo. From a distance, I watched Barbara addressing concerned residents, her white raincoat immaculate despite the weather. Her gestures were emphatic, reassuring. As I approached, I caught her mid-sentence. "These minor drainage issues are completely normal during rainfall," she proclaimed confidently. "Our development has state-of-the-art water management systems. Anyone claiming otherwise is simply fear-mongering." Several people noticed my arrival and fell silent. Barbara turned, her smile tightening when she saw me. "Perhaps our neighbor would like to explain the anonymous warnings being left in mailboxes," she said pointedly. "Causing panic helps no one." "Preparation is not panic," I responded calmly. "The water control system that protected this hillside for 70 years is gone. The consequences will be significant." Barbara stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You need to stop this campaign. The HOA can increase fines for disrupting community harmony." "This is not about HOA rules," I said, loud enough for others to hear. "This is about physics and water volume. When the main storm system arrives, everything downhill from my property will be in the direct path of uncontrolled runoff. No drainage system built for normal conditions can handle what is coming." A few neighbors looked troubled by this exchange. Gerald, standing nearby under a large golf umbrella, studied the increasingly muddy ground with concern. Others glanced nervously at their homes as the rain intensified. "The Weather Service predicts the main system will arrive within 48 hours," I continued. Anyone who wants specific advice on protecting their property is welcome to contact me directly. As I turned to leave, the rain suddenly intensified, driven by gusting wind. Drops pelted Barbara's perfect hair, flattening it against her head. Mascara began to run down her cheeks in thin black rivulets, a small preview of the dishevelment to come. For a moment, standing in the increasingly heavy downpour, she looked uncertain, vulnerable. Then her expression hardened again. "This meeting is adjourned," she announced. "The HOA Weather Committee will issue official guidance tomorrow." That night I stood at my window watching the strengthening storm. Lightning illuminated the hills in brief, stark flashes. With each thunderclap, I could hear water rushing down the channel where the dam had stood, growing louder by the hour. Nature was reclaiming its path, and nothing in its way would be spared. The major storm system arrived with apocalyptic force. Dawn barely broke through clouds so dense and dark they turned day into perpetual twilight. Rain fell not in drops but in sheets, creating a constant roaring backdrop that made normal conversation impossible. Weather alerts blared on phones and emergency radios throughout the morning, warning of flash flood conditions and advising residents to prepare for possible evacuation. From my elevated vantage point, I watched the hillside transform. Ground already saturated from days of preliminary rainfall could absorb no more. Water began seeking new paths, creating impromptu streams that grew in volume by the minute. Without the dam's careful management, the runoff formed not one controlled flow, but dozens of unpredictable torrents converging as they rushed downslope. My preparations proved adequate but barely. Water surrounded my house like a moat, held back by the sandbag barriers I had constructed. The pumps worked continuously, their mechanical drone joining the storm's symphony. I moved between windows, monitoring the situation from all angles, watching as my predictions tragically materialized below. The first serious flooding began in the northern section of Hillside Estates, where several homes sat in a slight depression. By mid-morning, water had breached their front doors, first as seepage, then as steady flows that overwhelmed desperate last-minute sandbagging attempts. Through binoculars, I could see homeowners wading through knee-deep water, carrying prized possessions to upper floors or vehicles. Gerald Fisher's home was among the first severely impacted. His carefully manicured garden transformed into a muddy lake within hours. His white colonial columns now stood in brown water that lapped at his front door. I watched him frantically moving items inside, his usual composed demeanor replaced by panic. By early afternoon, the situation deteriorated dramatically as the main channel, where my dam had once stood, overflowed its natural banks. Water cascaded downhill in a wide, churning mass, picking up speed and debris as it went. The drainage system designed for hillside estates had been overwhelmed almost immediately. Now storm drains became geysers, pushing water upward rather than removing it. Diane Montgomery's showcased Tudor home, which had been featured in real estate advertisements for the neighborhood, sat directly in this new river's path. Water punched through her French doors with such force that I could see furniture shifting position through the windows. Her elegant patio became submerged under swirling, debris-filled water that continued rising by the inch. But the most dramatic scene unfolded at Barbara Winter's home, the largest in the development, positioned prominently at the end of the main boulevard. Its location, once considered prestigious, now proved catastrophic. The converging water flows from multiple directions created a churning pool that rose with terrifying speed around her two-story colonial. The custom landscaping that had won community awards disappeared beneath muddy water. Her detached garage, with its elegant carriage-style doors, began floating, its foundation compromised by the surging waters. Through the rain, I spotted Barbara herself on her second-floor balcony, phone pressed to her ear, gesturing frantically. Even from a distance, her desperation was evident. She kept looking uphill, toward where the dam had stood, toward my property that remained relatively protected due to elevation and preparation. By late afternoon, emergency vehicles with flashing lights navigated flooded streets. First responders in yellow slickers used small boats to reach homes where water had cut off normal access. Evacuations began in the hardest-hit sections, creating a procession of shell-shocked residents carrying hastily packed bags to emergency shelters. The contrast between the flooding below and my relatively secure position was stark. While water surrounded my property, the sandbags and pumps maintained a defensive perimeter. My house remained dry inside, power still functioning thanks to a generator I had installed years earlier. I had become an island in a disaster that I had predicted but been powerless to prevent. As darkness fell, the rain finally began to slacken, but the damage was already catastrophic. Hillside Estates had been transformed from an upscale development to a disaster zone. Streetlights reflected off water that covered roads to depths of 3 feet or more in some sections. Cars sat partially submerged in driveways. Personal possessions floated between houses, garden furniture, children's toys, decorative items, all carried by currents that followed the very patterns my grandfather's dam had been designed to control. My doorbell rang unexpectedly just after 8 in the evening, startling me. I opened it to find 4 drenched people huddled on my porch, the Martinez family from 3 houses down the hill. Their home had flooded to the first-floor ceiling. "The emergency crews directed us here," Carlos Martinez explained, water dripping from his jacket. "They said your house was the only safe access point to this section of the hill." I immediately invited them in, providing dry clothes and hot drinks. As they warmed themselves by my fireplace, 6-year-old Sophia looked up at me with wide eyes. "How come your O's did not get flooded?" she asked innocently. Her father answered before I could form a response. "Mr. Anderson warned everyone this would happen," he said quietly. "He tried to stop it." Through my living room window, we could see emergency lights reflecting off the floodwaters below. The Martinez family was just the first of several neighbors who found refuge in my home that night. As I prepared spare bedrooms and made coffee for shocked evacuees, no one mentioned the HOA or the dam. They did not need to. The evidence of the catastrophic mistake surrounded us, visible through every window, audible in every crash of water against structures never designed to withstand such force. The rain stopped completely by morning, leaving behind an altered landscape. Sunlight revealed the full extent of destruction as floodwaters began slowly receding. Streets remained submerged under inches or feet of muddy water. Homes showed waterlines halfway up first-floor walls. Debris collected in haphazard piles, furniture, appliances, personal items now caked in mud. The air smelled of wet earth and mildew, the first signs of the long cleanup ahead. Emergency management officials arrived in force, establishing a command center in the community parking lot. Insurance adjusters moved from house to house, taking photographs and making notes as shell-shocked homeowners pointed out damage. Disaster relief organizations set up tents offering food, supplies, and information about temporary housing options. The community center, once the symbol of Hillside Estates' exclusivity, became a processing center for displaced residents. Tables were staffed by representatives from FEMA, insurance companies, and disaster relief organizations. Long lines formed as people sought assistance and answers. Initial damage estimates exceeded $15 million for the neighborhood alone. 3 days after the flood, an emergency HOA meeting was called. Unlike the orderly gatherings of the past, this one had raw emotion pulsing through the crowded room. The board members sat at their usual table, but their appearance had transformed. Barbara's perfect blonde hair hung limp and unwashed. Gerald's tailored suits had been replaced by donated clothing. Diane carried a binder of insurance forms instead of property listings. The meeting began without the usual formalities. Barbara cleared her throat nervously. "We have gathered to discuss recovery efforts and next steps." "How about we discuss why this happened in the first place?" interrupted Michael Collins, whose home had taken 4 feet of water. "My insurance company says this was not natural flooding, but the result of removed water controls." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Another neighbor stood up, tablet in hand. "I have been doing research. There was a dam on the Anderson property that controlled runoff from the hills. It was removed 3 months ago. Why?" All eyes turned to the board table. Barbara shifted uncomfortably before responding. The structure was non-compliant with HOA aesthetic guidelines. It was removed following proper procedures. The crowd erupted. Voices overlapped in anger and disbelief. Then someone connected a laptop to the projector. My emails to the HOA appeared on the wall, warnings, engineering reports, weather predictions, all dated weeks before the disaster. "You knew," Carlos Martinez said, standing to face the board. "You were warned repeatedly about what would happen." More evidence appeared on screen: Robert's professional assessment, the weather service warnings I had presented, even photographs of the dam before removal showing its clear purpose and function. The room fell silent as people absorbed the extent of the board's negligence. Barbara attempted damage control. We relied on assessments from qualified professionals who assured us modern drainage would be sufficient. "From the same company that built and sold us these homes," interjected another resident. "Did anyone independent verify their claims?" The meeting devolved into calls for resignation and discussions of legal liability. One by one, board members acknowledged their failure of judgment. By meeting's end, all 7 had submitted resignations. A temporary committee was formed to manage immediate needs and plan reconstruction. I had remained silent throughout, standing at the back of the room. As people dispersed, many approached me, some apologetic, others seeking advice about rebuilding. Barbara was the last to leave, stopping briefly beside me. Her carefully constructed facade had crumbled completely. "You tried to tell us," she said quietly, not meeting my eyes. I did not listen. "It was never about winning an argument," I replied. "It was about protecting everyone." She nodded once and left without further comment. Later that week, I learned that homeowners had filed a class action lawsuit against the former HOA board members, the developers, and the engineering firm that had dismissed the dam's importance. Insurance companies joined the suit, seeking to recover their massive payouts. Spring arrived with the community still rebuilding. The temporary committee approached me with an unexpected request. Would I help design a new water management system for hillside estates? Engineers had confirmed what my grandfather knew decades ago: the hillside required thoughtful water control to be safely habitable. On a warm Saturday in April, I stood with a group of neighbors at the site where my dam had once stood. Construction equipment waited nearby to begin work on its replacement, an improved version incorporating both my grandfather's principles and modern techniques. Children planted native water-loving vegetation along the planned retention areas. Adults worked together placing stone markers and preparing ground for concrete. "Will this prevent another flood?" asked Sofia Martinez, now helping her father lay stones. "If we work with nature instead of against it," I explained, "we have a much better chance." As I supervised the rebuilding of what had been destroyed, there was no satisfaction in having been proven right. The victory was not in vindication, but in watching a community learn, adapt, and come together. The new water management system would stand not just as flood protection, but as a monument to a simple truth: some things matter more than property values and aesthetic guidelines. Sometimes the most important community standards are those that keep everyone safe.